And I want to thank you for joining us during this time. And before we go any further, let me recommend that you share this with your friends so they can participate with us as well. Michael called me, Michael Horn, that's my son-in-law. For those of you who don't know, he's the one that you talk to on the phone when you call in who has the British accent. Just don't tell him it's an Australian accent, okay? It's British accent. But he called me last night and suggested that he had heard that his church and other churches had postponed their services, but they were going to do live streaming of it for their members to be able to watch. And he came up with the idea that everybody's going to be live streaming their church services, but who's going to live stream Sunday school? So his idea was that we provide you some sort of a Sunday school class during this time, but to focus on missions. So that's what I want to do. I want to talk to you today about missions, maybe say some things you've heard before or that you haven't heard before, but it's going to be very, very informal. You're going to hear me make a lot of mistakes as I'm speaking, but that's okay. First thing I made a mistake with was I put on a nice, fresh shirt to come do this in. Just got it back from the dry cleaners, been hanging in the closet. And on the way here, I stopped to get something to eat and spilled ketchup all over my shirt. So the first change we had to make was to put on a different shirt. So I'm here with my trusty Final Frontiers shirt on, which I believe you can order online if you're weird enough to want to have one. But I want to talk to you today about missions. Tell you a little bit about what we do and why we do it, how we do it. This is somewhat like I typically do when I go to a church. Usually the pastors will shut down Sunday school for the teenagers and above and bring them into a combined service, and I'll teach what I'm going to share with you now. I probably do a better job when I'm standing up in front of people talking instead of just looking at a camera, but hopefully I can give you some insights into our ministry. At Final Frontiers, we have to find a way to ascertain how well we're doing, what parts of our ministry work well, what parts may be fumbling or whatever. And so years ago, we came up with what we call a cost per conversion ratio, CCR, cost per conversion. Let me explain to you what that means. Every year there's a group, I think it's the Barna group, that does surveys around the world to see how much money came into ministries, how many souls were saved, how many were baptized, that sort of thing. And I remember reading it in 2010. I was in Virginia at a church, and I read an article that for that year, they had done a cost ratio. The way they did it was to say how much money did a ministry take in, and then how many people were saved as a result. And I think in their terminology, they were actually using baptisms as opposed to salvation decisions. But let's go with salvation because I'm not sure. So, for example, if a church took in $1 million a year, and don't you wish that was your church, and they had one person saved, then that means the cost ratio for that salvation was $1 million for one salvation. Well, as it turned out, worldwide in that year, 2010, the cost per conversion ratio was about $330,000 for every one soul saved. Now, I know that's going to stagger your mind. In America, it was much higher. Sweden, Norway, places like that, it was much higher. When you got down to like the Philippines, it was much, much, much lower. But that's because it's taken in considering all the money that's brought into a church. And then how many did they have saved? So I got curious. How well were we doing? And so we looked at our income for that year and divided that by the number of salvation decisions that had been reported to us through the preachers we support. And would you believe that while the world's average ratio was $330,000 per conversion, at Final Frontiers for that year, ours was, I think, $34.17 per conversion. That's astounding. That means for every $34.17 we received that year, it resulted in one person being saved. So we do that throughout our whole ministry, whether it be Touch Alive, a Daily Bread, Power Pack, smugglers, everything gets their own cost per conversion ratio. And then we can look at a ministry and say, it's struggling, maybe not because it's not getting in enough money, but that it's not having enough results. And that's why we're such sticklers about getting reports in from the preachers we work with. And then we want to share those reports with you. It's always on the last page of our progress report. So in case you're wondering why those numbers are there, it's just a way for us to continually, we don't do it once a year, we do it continually, be able to check and see how well we're doing, because we don't want to lose our focus. You know, a lot of ministries start off doing one thing, they grow big, they end up doing something else down the road. And our focus is always, has always been, and I pray to God always will be, on supporting the national preachers to win their own people to Christ, to baptize them, to train them, and then to teach young men to do likewise, so that it's a repetitive thing. What that means for us as a ministry is that we're never getting ahead. We're always falling behind, because the better we do, the more young men are being trained for the ministry, and we can't possibly keep up with all of them. That's why we started recently in the last year our Great Commission Fund, because we try to give men certain amounts of money. But in some parts of the world, they don't need as much as they do in other parts. Some areas, particularly if you're a tribal person out in the jungle, you might get by with $5 a month would be all you would need. Whereas if you're in that same country but living in the city, you may need $500 just because of rent and utilities and water and things like that. The way our system is set up, though, we ask people to give a certain amount for the preacher they choose. So sometimes a man ends up getting far more than he needs, while another man has far less than he needs. So we thought what we would do is come up with a new way of doing it. We're not getting rid of the old way, so don't get nervous, but a new way to begin promoting, and that is for people just to give to the Great Commission Fund. I'm doing that, for example. All the preachers my wife and I were supporting are now paid through the Great Commission Fund. Now, they're getting the same thing they were getting, but our money goes into a pool, so money that happens to be left over, if any is, now can go to help another guy instead of just sitting there because it's not enough. Does that make sense to you? You know, those of you who support other ministries like Bearing Precious Seeds, a great example, all the work they've done around the world, sending out Bibles or Gospels of John and Romans. You don't say, you may say as a church, we want to provide 10,000 Gospels of John and Romans, but you don't say which country they go to particularly. Maybe you do, if they let you. You don't say which area of the country it goes to, and you don't have any control over which families it goes to. But what if, just what if you did? What if you said, I want to give these 10,000, I want to go to this certain community in this certain country, and I want to know every family that receives one. I want to get a letter back from that family saying they received one. I want to get a photograph of them holding their hand out and receiving it from the preacher who gave it to them. And then that comes back to Bearing Precious Seed. They have to translate all that and keep up with who gave the New Testament for what family and get that back to that individual for you to say, aha, the program's working. Can you imagine the logistic nightmare that would be? Well, that was the brainchild I came up with 34 years ago, and it's worked. It's worked well. God's blessed us. But we've grown to the point that we cannot grow anymore if we keep doing it that way. So what we want to do now is treat our ministry like Brother Keene and those at Bearing Precious Seed treat it. We want people just to give to a fund from which we're not printing New Testaments, but through which we are supporting national preachers all over the world. Which means for every dollar you give, maybe all $1 goes to one guy, but in a sense, every penny of it goes to 100 different guys. So that's what our Great Commission Fund is all about now. It's new. Not too many people have jumped on board with us about it yet. Just yesterday, though, I got a call from a brother in San Antonio who supports a preacher in Honduras and one in Africa. And he had gotten a letter from Michael telling him that the brother in Africa we were no longer working with. I don't know if he died. I don't know if he no longer needs the funds. I don't know what the situation is. But this brother in San Antonio called and said, just give that extra money to the preacher I support in Honduras, so he'll have double. And I asked him, I said, well, brother, would you mind if we put that extra money into the Great Commission Fund instead? And he said, yeah, I've been reading about that. Go ahead and do it. Well, that $35 a month or $50 a month, whatever it is he's giving, now can go to help a lot of preachers, a lot of Timothys. We now have over 28,000 preachers in our network. You heard me right, 28,000. They don't all get paid. The majority of them, about 26,000, are Timothys, young men in training. But we have Timothys that have started 4 and 5 churches. They wouldn't be considered Timothy in another ministry. They are in ours because they haven't finished their training and because we don't have funds to support them. So the more of you who happen to give $5 a month or $5 a year or $5,000, whatever you want to give, it gives us more funds that we can now support more preachers with. So let me share with you, if I may, just a little bit more about our ministry and why we're doing it this way. Well, in 1986, September, I went overseas to Thailand to video the ministry of my mentor, a missionary named Tommy Tillman. And I know many of you have heard of him. He's one of the greatest guys who ever lived. And believe me, if the New Testament was being written today, Paul would have to give up some of his space to Tommy. He's just that good of a missionary. If you're not supporting him, I hope you'll look him up on the internet. Harbor Evangelism International. Great ministry. Working with lepers and doing a great job in evangelizing the country of Mongolia as well. Tommy's son Mitch, who I went to high school with, is in Mongolia. Now, I went there to help Tommy because he was constantly having to come back and forth to the U.S. to raise more money to build leper clinics and churches and hospitals for him and that sort of thing. And so I thought, why don't I go over and film some of his work, bring it back to America as a pastor, and I'll go raising the money for Tommy so he can stay over there and do the work God's called him to do. That was the purpose. But the scripture says, the heart of a man deviseth his way, but the Lord directs his steps. And my heart was to film to help this brother raise money for his ministry. But God's purpose for me going over there was not my purpose. Because once I got there, I met with some national preachers, and I saw the work they were doing. These were tribal men from the northern Burma, where China and Burma and I think it's Nepal come together. They told me they can walk out in their front yard and see 3 countries, live up high in the mountains as they did. And they had come as missionaries to Southeast Asia. They were speaking 10, 12, 14 languages, tribal languages. And I saw how hard these men were working, the results that they were creating, dozens of churches being started by them, and men in every village being trained for the ministry. And I asked them how much support they had, and they didn't know what I was talking about. And so I had to explain to them what the idea of support was. And they said, well, we don't have any. They lived off working in the rice paddies, whatever the case may be. And the evenings they'd go out and evangelize. And so I sat there with them in that hut that night, and I thought, if these guys had been able to do this much working full time, what could they do if they were full time in ministry? They didn't have to work in the rice paddies. They didn't have to, harvest the bananas and everything else they had to have to grow. So I asked them, how much money would you need to live on? And they had no idea because they had never had money to live on. I found out that time that the village where he interviewed, turned it upside down and shaking it, you wouldn't have got a nickel. Nobody there had any money. They all lived on bartering. I've got 2 eggs this morning, but no rice. You got some rice, you want to trade? And that's how they lived. But you know what? And I had a preacher friend who told me that they should be able to live that way. He didn't. But when we're affluent, we typically think that everybody else should be able to live without affluence, even though we can barely live with our affluence. And so I pointed out to him, I said, they can trade an egg for something. You can eat an egg, but you can't wear an egg. You can't strap it to your feet and walk through the jungle to another village. They need more than just eggs. They need more than just rice. There are things that they need money to buy. And I've been in many places in the world where I've seen people take 2-liter bottles of Coke or Pepsi, and they cut it up and put some holes in it and wrap a twine through it, and they make sandals out of 2-liter bottles of Coke. Well, I'd go barefooted till I was 1,000 years old before I think of something like that. But they're more intelligent than we are when it comes to surviving. But if I can buy a guy a nice pair of sandals that's going to last them more than a week, what is the harm in doing that? And so we decided what we would do is support these preachers instead. And when I say we, I mean the little church I was pastoring. So we took on 6 of these guys. I lived in LA at the time, so back then you could fly from LA to Bangkok for about $550. So I was going back a couple of times a year, then 3 times a year. And as I'd visit these guys, I'd see their ministries had exploded. They were starting more churches. They were training more men for the ministry. They were evangelizing more villages. Why? Because they had the funds to be able to do it with. They could now buy a bus ticket to get to the next trail in the road that they would travel on to see what was at the end of that trail. They had money to buy tracts or buy Bibles to give out to people. They had money to buy food to carry with them that wouldn't rot in a week's time. It's, like granola bars and things like that, that now they could go out and be gone for a month at a time. So I saw where just a little bit of money can make such a big difference for them. And the amount of money I'm talking about is $1 a day. That was it. They weren't buying new cars. They had no driveway to drive it, only they had it. They weren't going out and buying new clothes. Their wife made their clothes on a loom, a bamboo loom. They were just now had money for food to be able to survive and know that their families are going to get something to eat while they're going for a month's time evangelizing in the jungle. Well, I saw the advantage of this. I got excited. Some friends of mine in LA got excited. They started giving money, checks written to me, and I didn't like that. So we incorporated and started a ministry, and my assistant pastor named it Final Frontiers. I didn't come up with that name. We were actually in the studio. Some of you older folks remember the Beverly Hillbillies, and Jed Clampett was played by a guy named Buddy Epson. Well, Buddy Epson had a son named, I think his name was Douglas Epson, and he had just started a post-production studio in the Los Angeles area. And the guy who had done the camera work for me was friends of his. They went to church together. So we were one of his first customers. I remember one day as I finished doing the post-production work, I walked out in the lobby, and he came out and said goodbye, and looked out the window, and there was Andy Griffith in the parking lot. We were 2 floors up. He had just parked his car. He was coming up to do some work for his show, Matlock, I think it was at that time. So those were the kind of circles those guys were running in. But as he was finishing it, he said, now we finished everything. All we got to do is put your name on the front, your ministry name. What's your ministry name? And I hesitated. He turned around like this and looked up at me, and he said, tell me you have a ministry name. I said, well, when do you need to know what it is? He said, tomorrow morning. So I went back and talked to my assistant, told him the problem. A fellow named Mike Corsini, he owns his own business in the Seattle area now, quadriplegic since the age of 15. And Mike said, well, John, what is it you're trying to do? And I said, well, my hope is to be able to help fulfill the Great Commission by taking the gospel to those last places on the earth that have never been exposed to it. And he said, oh, so you want to boldly go with the gospel where no man has gone before? I went, yeah, I guess so. And he said, why don't you call it Final Frontiers? I thought, well, that's a catchy name. I think we will. And so we incorporated with that name. It worked good for me because in the beginning, I'd call up a preacher and he'd say, what's the name of your organization? I'd say, we're called Final Frontiers. And he'd say, I've heard of you guys. And I'd think to myself, you have not heard, we're only 3 weeks old. How could you have heard of us? But that name recognition of Final Frontiers did it. And since that time in 1986 till now, 2020, we're almost 34 years old or 35, whatever it is. Since that time, that's been our focus. Now, a lot of times people have said to me, how do you do what you do? How do you find these guys? How do you hold them accountable? And worse, why don't you like missionaries? So let me say this. I am a missionary. Our Lord said, a house divided cannot stand. I am a missionary. Our ministry is still standing. So obviously, I don't hate missionaries. I'm not opposed to missionaries. I just don't care for men who are lazy and don't get much work done. Am I saying that all missionaries are that way? My goodness, no. Some of the missionaries I've met around this world work circles around me, and I think I'm deserving of everything I get. But the majority of missionaries I met around the world, for one reason or another, are not worthy of what they're receiving. When I see men who are getting $7, $8, $9, $10, $11, $12,000 a month support, who've never started a church, who are pastoring a church with 30 people, or who haven't even finished deputation yet and already pulling in that kind of money, That's absurd. It's not right. It's not proper. It's not ethical. And it's a waste of God's resources on men, the majority of whom will never make it to the mission field. Let me tell you one reason why we do what we do. Being a missionary, I'm privy to facts and information that pastors aren't. And typically, we keep this kind of information to ourselves because we don't want to make the career look bad. But I think you have a right to know. Missionary Gil Anger and some friends of his did a survey just a few years ago among independent Baptist mission boards, just independent Baptist mission boards. I don't know how many they solicited, but 21 of them responded to the questionnaire, the survey that they sent out. And I'm going to share with you some information. I hope I have the numbers correct, but if I don't, it's not going to be far off. Such things as of the men who start on deputation and never finish it, I believe it's 73%. Now you stop and think about that. You've sat in your church when young men have come by who have great intentions, look like they're going to be able to get the job done. They talk a good talk. They definitely have a burden for where they're wanting to go. They believe God has called them. But out of 100 of them, 73 will never get to the mission field. They'll never finish deputation. Those who do finish deputation and get to the mission field, some 42 or 43%, I think, of those will quit before their third year. So they got there, they learned the language, and they came home. Is that why you were supporting them as a missionary, to learn a language and come home? Of those who do make it to furlough and come home for that year to report back to their supporting churches, 55% of those will never go back to the mission field. It's astounding when you think that the majority of men who start out to be a missionary will not make it to their fifth year. But yet, from day one, they are fully supported. If you're a business owner, would you do that for your new employees? No. If you're a pastor of a church, would you do that for your staff? No. You'd have a probation time that they've got to prove themselves, and then you would begin raises. And you certainly wouldn't like the idea of them making more than you're making, or 2 times more than you're making, or 3 times more. Now, let me say this. I have no problem with a missionary making a lot of money. Hint, hint. I have no problem whatsoever with that, as long as he's using the money in a wise and stewardship manner. But if he's just using it to buy new cars, build bigger houses, that's not what missions is all about. Missions is about spreading the gospel around the world. If he lives in a nice house, I don't care. What is wrong with that? He's a servant of God. Why shouldn't he have a nice house to live in? If a pastor can live in a nice house, why can't the missionary? If a deacon can, why can't the missionary? So I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with him driving a good car, a reliable car. There's nothing wrong with these things, but it's when those things become the object. Look, if you're supporting me with a full-time income and I need a new car 4 years from now, why should I write you a letter and ask you to give an offering for me to buy a new car? Why should I tell you I need an oil change or new tires? You're already supporting me more than you make. Why can't I budget that? Why do I need you to pay the school bill for my kids to go to a Christian school in the country I'm serving in? You're paying for your kids to go to Christian schools, and you make less money than I do. And by the way, where I'm living, a dollar goes a lot further than it does where you're living. You say, there you go again, you're putting down missionaries. If that's what you think, I'm sorry for you. I'm not putting down missionaries. I'm telling you how the system can be abused. Why do we work with national preachers? Because we don't give them enough money for that to happen. We don't try to keep them poor. But our purpose is not to put them on a salary. Our purpose is to give them a subsidy to help them better do what they're already doing before we ever met them. You see, when a man applies to us for help, his recommendation has to come from either a missionary from a fundamental board or from a national preacher with whom we already have a working relationship. They have to base their recommendation on a long-term personal knowledge of that man and his ministry. If they haven't known him well and known him long, we don't even consider the application. So therefore, we know that we're getting the cream of the crop. After they recommend them to us, he has an application to fill out. Then we have the opportunity to investigate them. If he says he started 5 churches, who are those churches? He has to give us the names and where they're located. Now we can send someone to that village and find out who started this church. If we get a different answer from what his application says, then we're not even going to consider him for support because he wasn't honest with us. So we try to vet these guys so that when we present them to you for support, we can have the confidence that they're not going to embarrass us down the road by you finding out later that they were a charlatan or a fake or lazy or whatever the case may be. So we look for certain men. What are the criteria that we look for? Sharp, well-dressed, good speaker? No. Those things might impress an American congregation, but they don't impress us. And I'm not so sure they impress the Lord either. We're looking for men who've already fulfilling the Great Commission in their own life. In other words, we want to find men who are already starting churches, men who are already baptizing converts, men who are already leading folks to Christ, men who are already discipling other men for the ministry. We're looking for veterans, not novices. Remember when Paul first started out on his missionary work? He and Barnabas, and they took a young man along with them named John Mark. Well, he was the cousin of Barnabas. And so Barnabas wanted to put him under his wing and train him, but by the time they got to their second stop, he quit and went home. Well, Paul didn't have much use for him after that, but if you read Paul's writings later on in his life, he literally requested John Mark to come. He said he was profitable to me for the ministry. He wanted, because even though Paul gave up on him, Barnabas didn't, and Barnabas took that homesick or lazy or whatever he was young man and turned him into something good. By the way, do you know who traditionally who Peter's translator was when he went to Rome? John Mark. One of the largest church congregations, assemblies of congregations in the early church was in the city of Alexandria, Egypt. Guess who started that ministry and who pastored there? John Mark. So he was a successful man in the ministry. But we, like Paul, do not have time to, I don't like to use the word, but to waste on guys who aren't ready for the ministry yet. They need to go with the Barnabas and get some training. We want to work with the Timothy, the Titus, the Philemon, the Onesimus, the Aristarchus, and the Rufus, and so forth. We want to work with the guys who've already proven themselves. Why? Because everybody in third world countries will come to you and say, if you'll support me, I'll go back to my home village, or I'll go to this town, I'll start a church. If you will, I will, is what they're saying. You know, that's probably been the number one criticism I've heard from people who are against supporting nationals. They say they're only doing it for the money. If you'll support me, I'll go do such and such. And that is a tragedy. I would have to agree with them on that. But can we be fair? When was the last time a missionary came to your church and said, I believe God has called me to X country, and if I get enough support, I'm going to go. But if I don't, I'm going anyway. I'll move there anyway. I'll live on the street if I have to. I'll cut hair for a living. I'll empty trash for a living. I'll do whatever I have to do to be where God called me. When was the last time you heard that in the church? I know the answer. Never. They're all saying, if you'll support me, I'm going to go. So why is it an American can say that and it's spiritual, but if a non-American says it, it's corruption and laziness and sloth and greed? Why is that? I think we may be judging them a little bit more strongly than we judge ourselves. But that was notwithstanding, we look for guys who've already done it. Doctrinally sound, morally pure, verifiable experience in starting churches and training men for the ministry. Those are the guys that we vet and that we present to you for support. And I don't remember what the stats are, but basically they end up starting on average about 1.5 to 2 churches a year per preacher. In some countries it's more, in some it's less. People say, how can they possibly start that many churches? My viewpoint is we must have some lazy guys if that's all they're doing. Keep in mind, these guys are perpetual church planters. If you were a shoe salesman and only sold 2 pairs of shoes a year, how long would you keep your job? Not very long. These guys are perpetual church planters. Yeah, they're pastors, They're evangelists, they're teachers at Bible schools, but they are church planters. That's what they live to do. So why aren't they doing more? I don't know, a bunch of lazy guys, I guess. But the reason they're able to do that many is because they all have Timothys, 1, 5, 50 or more men that they're training for the ministry. Now, I go to Honduras every summer to host visionary trips. We got a lot of people coming this summer if this coronavirus thing goes away. Right now, to go to Honduras, we'd have to walk. And I haven't learned how to walk on water yet. But I'm praying this thing clears up so people can go down. But every summer when we're there, we start churches. We don't intend to. It just happens. I mean, literally it happens. We're going to go to a village, and on the way there, we're passing through a village, and I see a bunch of adults out here, and I think, we got time, let's stop. And we go and we witness to them, and 8 or 10 or 12 of them get saved. And you ask them, do you have a church around here? No. We could come back and do a Bible study for you once a week. Where could we do it? Right here under this tree? But you can do it in my house if you want to. Okay, where do you live? That third house right down there with the green door. Okay, when would be good? How about the same time next week? Okay, y'all be there, bring your wives and kids with you. A church has been born. You say, no, it's not that easy to start a church. It's that easy to start a church. The difference is, what we've been trained to do is to stop, give them a tract, and then drive on. Or if you're really zealous, stop, give them a tract, witness to them, get them to say a prayer, and then drive on and never see them again. But that's not the biblical pattern. You win them, you baptize them, you teach them the whole counsel of God. Now, how can I possibly go back there next week and for another church and another church and another church? You get to where the most you could handle would be maybe 14 to 21 churches, and then you can't start anymore. But what if you have 14 or 21 Timothys that you're training for the ministry? They know more than those guys you just led to Christ know. Why can't they go and teach them the knowledge they've already gained? And as I'm teaching these Timothys more, they have more and more and more to teach these new converts. Now, I just got back from Honduras. Last year when I got there, our pastor Fidel told me he had started another church in a little tiny village called Huaricayan. And I took all the groups there. It's the one that you sat out on the porch. You had children on one porch and adults on another porch. Well, I just got back from Honduras, and he told me he has started another church. I said, where? He named some village I've never heard of. I said, where is it? He said, you go on the road to Huaricayan, and you go for 30 more minutes down that road driving. We had bought him a four-wheeler last year, so he's taking good advantage of it. So he has started another church. We started a church with our brother Ricky Torres and a group from City Baptist in Hammond. 2 years ago, I think, started the church. And my home church, Providence Baptist in Augusta, helped with it as well over a 2-week period. Pastor Carlos Mason began going out there every other week to preach to those people. He has a church in Tegucigalpa 4 hours away, and every other week on Saturday, he goes out there, spends the day with them, then drives back late at night to go to preach at his own church on Sunday. Well, I got to Honduras in the first few days of March, and Carlos told me that they've started another church up there. Where? He named the village. I said, I'm not familiar with that village. He said, it's the last village you pass through before you get to Rio Arriba. I said, so you started there and you're working your way back towards us. And he said, yeah, basically, there were some people who heard about the church in Rio Arriba, came to it. They asked me to come to their village, so I went there, and we've got a church going there now. These guys are perpetual church planters, and that's why our ministry progresses the way it does. That's why God blesses us the way he does. And he's blessed us with you, more than you could possibly understand, more than you could know. But you are blessing our ministry, because the funds that we're giving to these men to pay for their gas to get to these villages, to have food to eat, to take care of their families, it's not our money. It's yours. Well, it's God's. But God put it in your heart to send it our way so that we can get it to the guys who really, really need it. And again, not to beat a almost dead horse, but that's why the Great Commission Fund is so important. We've always asked, I think now we ask $50 a month for a family to support a preacher. And then you know who he is, you get his picture, all like that. But a lot of people don't have $50 a month, or they'd like to help more than one preacher. Well, stick an extra $5 in there and designate that for the Great Commission Fund, and you'll be helping more preachers. If you got 10, put $10 in there. If you can't do it every month, do it as often as you can do it. I'm telling you, the more funds you give us to disseminate to these preachers around the world, the more they're going to be able to do with it. Now, I hope you a little bit enjoyed my talk and my rambling. If you did, comment, let us know that you like it. If you have suggestions or if you want us to keep doing this, again, maybe next week or whatever. But now I think I hear the Sunday school class bell ringing. It's time for us to log off and let you go to your church service. Remember, your church needs your offering, your tithes and offerings, so help them out as well. We'll live off the alms that you want to give us, and we'll do well by them. God bless you. See you next time.